So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Nan Crowder, and I'm the Dean of the College of Health and Human Development. And on behalf of the students, faculty, staff, and alumni of the College of Health and Human Development, I'm really delighted to welcome you to today's lecture. This lecture is a great example of the spirit of collaboration that is so pervasive in our college. Today's lecture is part of the Distinguished Alumni Speaker Series, which is sponsored by the College of Health and Human Development Alumni Society. This lecture was established in 2005 in order to celebrate alumni who have been very successful in their professional lives and to allow these alumni to share their knowledge and expertise not only with students in the college, but with the entire university community. This event is also taking place as part of the Delisavoy Program Support Endowment for the Protection of Children and the Child Maltreatment Solutions Network. I would now like to invite Jenny Knoll, Professor of Human Development and Family Studies and Director of the Child Maltreatment Solutions Network, to the podium to discuss why today's speaker is here at just the right time. And I was teasing our speaker, she's kind of a rock star at Penn State because she's been part of the child maltreatment training that we've all taken online. You'll recognize her. When we have so much to be proud of in terms of our commitment to being a national leader in child abuse prevention. So Jenny, welcome. There she is.
Thank you so much, Dan. Thank you everyone for coming, and I just want to say one thing, that a couple of our classes, our child maltreatment classes, are letting out soon, so all these seats will fill up very quickly. Don't be worried if people come in late, so sorry, timing matters. So thank you so much, Dan, and we need to understand that this lecture is also made possible by the Vladimir Delisavoy Program Support Endowment for the Protection of Children from the Department of Human Development and Family Studies. And let me just tell you a little bit about Val Delisavoy, if I can. Val served as a faculty member in the department for over 20 years, and his life's work focused on helping abused and neglected kids and their families. The Delisavoy family, represented here by Charlotte, right? Greg, and Linda, right, have continued this legacy. This endowment, his work has tremendous impact. One of the things this endowment did was it created the first ever Penn State course on child maltreatment. And that course is now the introductory course for what we have just established in the last year and a half, a minor in child maltreatment and advocacy studies. Hundreds and hundreds of students take this class every semester. In fact, we're bursting at the seams. So that work lives on. And part of the minor is an endowed internship. So now we have the Delisavoy interns as part of the Child Maltreatment and Advocacy Studies minor. And I'd like to introduce those interns now, if I may. And could you stand when I say your name? Thank you. Right, so we have Margaret Costa from the College of Science, Alexis Jefferson, College of Nursing, and this year's upcoming interns, Rachel Koval from HHD, and Lydia Harris from Nursing. So thank you, and thank you for devoting your careers to the well-being of children, right? And we look forward to hearing what you do in the future. Thank you. With April being Child Abuse Prevention Month, it's fitting that I can announce for the first time, myself at Penn State, that Penn State has received a large NIH grant to become the capstone center in the country for child maltreatment research and training. It's a commitment from NIH for the first time for this kind of research, $7.7 million, and an impressive matching contribution from the university of $3.4 million, of which Nan was a significant part of that. Thank you again. So I know Dave is going to introduce our speaker first, but she's a good friend of mine, so I just want to say a few words. So Janet,
Uh-oh, you're going to be scooped.
I'm going to be scooped. No, I promise.
Okay.
Janet has been very influential in my life. She's a leader in our field, and it was Janet that helped me conceptualize to a large degree how I wanted the Capstone Center grant to run. And Janet has helped me think about childhood sexual abuse prevention, and I'm proud to say that the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania is working with the subcommittee that Janet was on, and we are going to do a randomized controlled trial of a universal childhood sexual abuse prevention program in Pennsylvania starting next fall. So thank you for your help. So thank you for your help. Thank you, Jim.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Hopefully you can hear me okay. Well, works well for these guys. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Janet Rosenzweig. The Health and Human Development Alumni Society is pleased to be one of the sponsors of today's lecture. As Nan mentioned previously, the Distinguished Alumni Speaker Series lecture was established to highlight our most accomplished alumni, and so we are thrilled to be able to partner with other organizations at the college to bring this amazing alumna to campus. Janet Rosenzweig has devoted her entire career to protecting children from child abuse. After completing her bachelor's and master's degree from Penn State in individual family studies and then health education, she went to work for one of the first child sexual abuse programs in the country in the state of Tennessee. Janet managed child welfare programs in both Tennessee and Texas, and then returned to the East Coast to earn her PhD in social work from Rutgers University. In the next phase of Janet's career, she continued her groundbreaking efforts to put in place policies and structures to help prevent child abuse and to help victims of child abuse. She helped shape policies surrounding child sexual abuse while working in the New Jersey Department of Human Services, serving as the leader in Mercer County as the Director of Human Services, and founding one of the first county commissions on sex abuse in New Jersey. In 2001, the next phase of Janet's career began when she left state government to serve as Executive Director of Prevent Child Abuse New Jersey. Through this role and other recent efforts, she has continued to draw attention to child sexual abuse and to educate people about how to protect children. Janet currently serves as Executive Director of the American Professional Society on the Abuse of Children, and in 2011, she wrote a book entitled The Sex-Wise Parent, The Parent's Guide to Protecting Your Child, Strengthening Your Family, and Talking to Kids About Sex, Abuse, and Bullying. In 2012 and 2013, she helped design and write Penn State's online training program in sexual abuse prevention, which is now mandatory for all faculty and staff. Janet, we are so proud to count you among our alumni, and we are delighted to have you here today to share the results of your work. Please join me in welcoming Janet to the podium.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Okay. I must check with the media person. Is this where you want me to stand? He's happy? Okay, if he's happy, I'm happy. I do a lot of public speaking on these issues around the country, and nothing has been, people who have been with me all day can tell you I've been a nervous wreck about the thought of making this particular address to this particular audience in this particular building. I have very deep emotional ties to Penn State and to State College. I came from a family that was pretty shaken up by family dysfunction. Divorce before it was well known. My mom was a displaced homemaker before there was such a name for that sort of thing. And my mom kind of bootstrapped herself and got herself back to college while we were kids. And one summer, she could afford camp for my little brother. My older sister was old enough to work, but what to do with the middle child? So, social work student that she was, Mom got me a job as a volunteer at a daycare center, but not just the kind of daycare center where you play tags and sing songs. It was run by the Federation of Jewish Agencies and had comprehensive social services for the entire family. And I walked into that building at 14 and a half years old and found an entire profession of grown-ups dedicated to easing the pain of children. And I have never looked back. And when I found myself at the College of Human Development as a 17-year-old freshman living across the lawn in McElwain, which is still there, I felt that I had found not just those grown-ups that had been my mentors and guides as a child, but the people with the academic credentials and the teaching ability that could help me become the professional that I really, really wanted to be. I have to name some of those people because they're known to all of you. And you know, you see the string of alphabet soup after my name, including that last degree, which is from Harvard. So I've spent my time in academics. But the people that shaped my career at this department were just spectacular. My advisor was Dr. Stella Goldberg, if anybody remembers her. And then she switched me. My second advisor was a man named Carl Ridley. And Dr. Ridley, much to my dismay at the time, said, any student of mine that's going to get a degree in family studies has to take a course in human sexuality. Sex is part of family life. And I was, you know, kind of your typical girl who had gone through high school in the 70s, and the only course was this 400-level biology of sex course, and I fought him, and I didn't want to do it, and I didn't want to take it. And against my will, I took Bio 341 or 441, and that set my career. Because at the same time that Penn State was starting to provide an academic focus on human sexuality, the pharmaceutical industry just started mass producing the oral contraceptives. And what did that mean here at Penn State? 2 gynecologists and 20,000 girls. What are we going to do? So what Rittenauer did was decide to start a peer contraceptive education program, and they recruited the students from Dr. Wickersham's class and then trained us to work at University Health Services to become the peer educators. So I did just learn that Dr. Wickersham passed away last week, and so my career in part stands as a testimony to the work that he did, and as in my undergraduate. And I had my capstone. For those of you who are doing your capstone as a Delisavoy scholar, my capstone was staying at Rittenauer and developing the peer contraceptive education program into pretty much the same format it is today, developing the training so it was now eligible for academic credit. And as I was graduating and about to leave to go to Maryland for my master's degree, Rittenauer cut a deal with the health ed department and said, we need to keep her. So I continued on and got my master's degree, and there I came across my master's advisor, Dr. Pat Bartholow-Koch, who has been my friend and mentor since the 70s. So thank you for being here today, Pat. And I left this university in 1977 with a bachelor's and a master's degree in health, and thanks to Pat and our colleague, Dr. Elaine Young, certified as a sex educator. So when I found myself, for reasons that would drive a parent crazy, living in Knoxville, Tennessee, after I defended my master's thesis, I'm done, I'm finished, down in Tennessee, I was recruited to work on a project that had to do with child sex abuse. Now, this is 1977, and child sex abuse did not, 78 by then, did not exist as a profession. The first laws that created our profession, CAPTA, the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, was, and I always say, the most bipartisan piece of legislation, you know, written by Mondale, signed by Nixon, and sometimes I say those names in front of students and they don't know who I'm talking about, but please tell me you all know who Mondale and Nixon are. Thank you so much. So it passed in 74, the first funds started flowing in 76, so there we are with the first grant to be one of 2 people staffing a sex abuse helpline. And the executive director of this big nonprofit in Tennessee, Charles Gentry, another mentor whose name deserves to be mentioned as I'm being honored today, Gentry believed that, well, if I hire someone that understands human sexuality and someone that understands child abuse, they'll figure this thing out. So we hired a sex educator and a CP and a child protective services worker and said, figure it out, ladies. And for many, many years, my work in child sex abuse really came from the focus as a sex educator. And all through the 80s, that was a valid, respected part of the kind of work that has to be done to prevent child sex abuse, to help people recover who've been involved with child sex abuse. And then I left Tennessee, lots of other things happened, and my career took a very broad turn with public child welfare. I started working in government for the 90s, and by the time I got back to child abuse work in 2001, the neutered 90s had happened, right? Jocelyn Elders, the most well-credentialed Surgeon General working for President Clinton, is forced out of her job because she said at a United Nations conference in response to a question about, gee, do you think maybe we should teach kids about masturbation, because this is a World AIDS Day conference, because masturbation is a safer alternative to sex with a partner. And when she answered in the affirmative, well, that could be a good idea, it's certainly safer, she was pilloried for promoting masturbation among children and forced to resign her job. This is the environment of the 90s, and something happened in the 90s along with the proliferation of sex offender registries, Megan's laws, where suddenly sex abuse prevention and promoting sexual health and safety went from really building the kind of strengths in families and communities that Dr. Delisavoy promoted, right? Really empowering parents and families with the resources they need to raise safe and healthy kids. That stuff sort of went away in the 90s, and sex abuse prevention became all about looking on a registry. And it became really important that we come full circle and really take the full comprehensive look at what does it take to keep kids sexually safe and healthy. And I so applaud the work that's being done by Dr. Knoll and by the center, because we're really going to make Pennsylvania a leader in the nation and a leader in the field. And I'm just thrilled to death to even be acknowledged as having a peripheral role in the kind of work you're doing. But that was by way of background and how I got to what I'm going to be talking a little bit more in detail about today, which is how we measure child well-being. And why am I even, how did someone, I often get the question, how did a sex educator, here we go. I often get the question, how in the world did a sex educator get into public human services? Well, and the answer is through child sex abuse work. But then I get the answer, the question, how in the world, did you get involved with measuring child well-being? Well, as we were going through my credentials, one of the parts we didn't talk about is I spent about 4 years as the vice president for research and programs at Prevent Child Abuse America. So wearing that old hat, I want to thank you so much for having the Pinwheel Gardens. That's the national symbol of Prevent Child Abuse America. I've suggested that you take pictures of the wonderful Pinwheel Gardens you've got, send them to Prevent Child Abuse America. They'll get them up on the website. But we're all about strengthening families and communities so that families have the resources they need to raise strong and healthy children. We are very much about the fact that there's too many people who think that counting black and blue marks and giving out an 800 number is child abuse prevention. That's not. That's not. Knowing how to recognize the sign that a child has already been subjected to something is very important, and I don't want to downplay how important that is. But real prevention means building strengths in individuals, families, and communities before any abuse can happen. And that's so much in line with the legacy of Dr. Delisavoy's work. So it's just wonderful to have the chance to be there. So while I was in the role of vice president, Prevent Child Abuse America went through a strategic planning process, as organizations ought to do every decade or so. And strategic plan goal 4 took over my life, which was develop a standardized assessment for child well-being that's aligned with national and international methodologies and is useful to both the community and state levels. Now, I see Dr. Koch laughing and smiling because this is only slightly more complicated than the thesis that I took on back in the day. And then, so this sounds like to some people, it could be a relatively simple question. The president and CEO that I work for asked a question that I've heard Jenny ask, I've heard other people ask: how do we know we're moving the needle on child well-being in our state, in our country, and in our communities? And that is a very, very, very good question. One of the ways that people first started looking at it is by using something called social indicators. We count things that are going on in society. And social indicators were first established by Hoover when he did the Committee on Social Trends in 1929. Their first reports came out in 1933. So in the middle of the Depression, you can imagine the kind of social indicators they were looking at. HEW issued a big report in '69. Lots and lots of methodologic work went on this stuff in the 60s and 70s. And if you're interested, these are some really, really great resources on the history of how we measure human well-being in our communities. I really recommend them a lot. But the social indicator movement really, really, really took hold during the Great Society. And for those of you who don't know what the Great Society is, the hallmark legislation of President Lyndon Johnson, where the concept was that we can use social sciences to cure social ills. Medical sciences can cure health problems, social sciences can cure social problems. And we really saw the beginning of the development of the profession of social work in the mid to late 60s, and the social indicator movement really gained steam when we were asking the question, how can we tell if all of the money that's coming out of these Great Society initiatives are having an impact? In 1975, the Foundation for Child Development, who's a really interesting organization, a large child welfare nonprofit, the oldest one in the country, actually started out as the auxiliary group to the New York Society for the Protection of Children, which some of you may know from the original story of Mary Ellen, the child abuse victim, and there were no child abuse laws to protect her. So the original court case to protect a child had to come to court under animal welfare laws. Also some more interesting, yes, that's true, I see some head shaking. But so the Foundation for Children was the auxiliary attached to the nonprofit that was behind the original child abuse laws. But they were calling for, in the 70s, subjective surveys of children. Imagine that, you're actually asking the kids, how are you doing? Surveys where the macro structural influences on children, such as the economy and culture, are studied. What do you think would happen if we looked at that now, right? Digress for a minute. Okay, macro influence on children, such as the economy and culture. A couple of weeks ago, I was asked to present at a conference in California and talk about kids and sexting. And I think they thought I was going to come in and talk all about how we should teach our kids not to do it, and that's all important. But the truth is, sexting is now part of sexual development, and it's like second base. Something like 70% of all kids have shared a suggestive picture. And so when my call to action to this community was, let's change the social norms in this community so that the child whose picture is shared is not shamed to the point of destroying her mental health, that's talking about what kind of macro structural influences on children. So I use that as an example of what should we be looking at in the environment when we're thinking about the well-being of children, okay? The third thing that they called for back 40 years ago was statistical time series data that measures change over time collected by federal agencies for wide dissemination of data in order to put child development research into the broader perspectives and to help form policy. Yay! Yay, we love that. Where is it? You know, well here, this is just the background on who is the Foundation for Child Development that was behind all that push. And then we see them also calling for surveys where kids speak for themselves. And the interesting thing about the 70s is that also coincided with another movement we don't hear about anymore, and that's the children's rights movement. And at the same time, we had the women's rights and different minority rights. There was a huge children's rights movement, and as a matter of fact, the Children's Defense Fund, Marian Wright Edelman, she originally was, their original call to action was to be the Agency for Children's Rights on the same analogy as the NAACP. So she left the NAACP with the thought of taking what we know about African Americans' rights and applying that to rights for children, but over the course of time, the mission changed. So all of this is all kind of to give you the zeitgeist of what was going on in the 70s. And so we started to see some things happen in the 70s that were very, very promising about the development and bringing forth of data. And then something happened in the 90s, along with kind of that neutered 90s stuff that I talk about. But one of the things that we saw happen in the 90s was we saw the devolution of a lot of federal programs from federal responsibility to state responsibility, right? So we saw that, we saw an increase in block granting. So instead of states having to collect uniform data and report it to a federal agency, states had much more latitude to do what they want. And at that time, I was working in state government in some of the initial welfare reform initiatives where states could get waivers and test different ways to do things, all of which was wonderful. But the downside of that was we lost in a lot of areas the ability to collect uniform data on key social indicators from the different states. So we see a new initiative come about in 1994. This organization is still there, the Federal Interagency Forum on Child and Family Statistics, and you can read what they do at childstats.gov. So if you're interested in this stuff, go to childstats.gov, and I will tell you, I guess I'm on the record because I'm being recorded, sometimes when I'm on that site, I just keep thinking of the Tower of Babel, because no two people on that site are talking the same language. And as someone who at one point in government insisted that we develop a committee on operational definitions as we design new intake forms for clients, that's really kind of difficult. It's good data when each data point stands on its own, but can they be put together to give us anything but fruit salad? I would say in most cases that answer is no. So there's indicators report that still comes out. There's a major nonprofit player in this field. It's called Child Trends. Many of you have probably heard of Child Trends. They were established by the Foundation for Child Development. They used to be a branch of the Foundation for Child Development before they were spun off and moved into their own offices in DC. And they are most known for producing a report called Kids Count. Have all of you heard of the Kids Count? Any of you heard of the Kids Count report? Okay, that's sort of like the report that everybody goes to. And what Kids Count does is it looks at all the different social indicators, but what it does is it ranks the states and where they are out of 50. And the problem with that is your relative rank might change because somebody else did better or worse. So if you were to say that Pennsylvania went from 30th in education to 10th in education, that may mean that you did a lot better in Pennsylvania, but it might also mean that 20 other states just did worse. So while Kids Count is very, very accepted, it's appreciated, and it really has limits to the way we can use it. So what's missing? The ability to compare between states and produce meaningful trend analysis. So as part of our work at Prevent Child Abuse America, we reviewed seven major international reports on child well-being and 4 United States produced indices, and we found that the major domains were pretty much the same across study. Health, education, safety, family, and environment. Everybody thinks that's what we need to measure. The domains, the dimensions within each domain can vary widely, and even more, making it more difficult to compare for trends is operational definitions can vary widely. For example, measures of infant mortality, some include stillbirths and some don't, right? And if you don't look at the details, so you might look at, this country looks better on stillbirths in this report than it does in another. You have to read. Measures of breastfeeding vary by the amount of time the mom spent breastfeeding. Some people consider it, you've breastfed a baby if you make it to 3 months, some say 6 months, etc. Measures of educational completion vary by the inclusion of children in the denominator who had stopped their education the prior year. So it's how do we define a cohort, right? So we have to really look at, when you pick up these reports, even the ones that come from the UN and have these fabulous imprimaturs on them, read the operational definition so you really know what you're talking about. Teen births is another one. In some studies, it's birth per 1,000 females aged 15 to 17. Other ones, it's any birth to anybody 17 years or under. So we've got, again, the Tower of Babel. So back to my assignment, right? A standardized measure. So what we then did is we looked at every single data element that was collected by Child Trends, and we worked with Child Trends to do that, and a wonderful grad student. And we looked at every data element they collected and asked the question, is it available at the state level? Is it available at the municipal or county level? Has the data been consistently available for the past 5 years using the same operational definition? And is there a reason to believe it'll continue to be collected, right? Because you really need that to be true if you're going to use it for trend analysis. So I thought a picture's worth 1,000 words. Of all the data elements collected by Child Trends, only the ones you see highlighted in green meet all of the criteria, and the ones in yellow come close. So of all of the data that Child Trends is maintaining, and Child Trends now is the legacy of the call by the feds for social indicators on kids. Of all the data they're maintaining, we come up with a handful of indicators that we can actually use to track kids over time. Consistent, measured the same way, children in poverty. The census data is children in poverty, homeless children and youth, juveniles in detention, teen births, educational attainment. And some generally reliable sources are from the Federal Department of Health, the Youth Risk Behavior Surveillance System, try to say that real quick, census data, public health data, and criminal justice and juvenile justice data. Because what you'll notice is missing here is any human services data, right? Human services data has so much variability in it that we really, really find it very, very difficult to use for trend analysis. So other dating violence, high school youth carrying weapons, physical fighting by youth, sexually experienced teens, teens pregnancy, and young adults or jail and prison. So some of the health indicators, things that we can get from the census and things that we can get from correction seem to be the most amenable to they're available for states, because if we want to look at Prevent Child Abuse America, we cared about what was going on in all 50 states. Right? Well, I have to say, and you can see by this, we gave up on the whole kind of municipal or county level pretty quick when we found that we could barely find enough indicators that consistently describe states. And let's shift gears a little bit and shift gears and look from looking at child well-being and look for a little bit about what kind of data do we have about child maltreatment. CAPTA, the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, calls for 2 national studies. The first one, an annual summary and analysis of data submitted into each state's Child Protective Services system, and that's that report, I think this one. So this comes out every year, this is the 26th year. So in January of 2017, they published the report Child Maltreatment 2015, right? They take all of the 2015 data, spend 2016 analyzing it, and the report comes out early the next year. So that's the most recent. But the other study is the National Incidence Study, and we're going to talk a little bit about the pros and cons of both of those. One of my projects that I always did for Prevent Child Abuse America every year was I did an analysis of the Child Maltreatment 2015, the annual report, to help each of our states know how to use those numbers, what they did and didn't mean. We don't want, as advocates, we don't want people pulling a number out of a report, using it when they're lobbying, and then have someone say, no, 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 you have that number wrong. So it was very important to us, to me as the Vice President for Research, that all of our state leaders have good numbers to use in their advocacy. One of the problems with using the NCANDS data to describe trends is that the definitions vary hugely among states. Hugely. What might be accepted for service in New Jersey might not be in New York or Connecticut. And this goes exactly with what I was saying before when I was talking about welfare data. When the federal government devolves authority down to the state and local levels, we don't get uniformity at the state, among the states. So the states have to meet some minimum criteria as specified in CAPTA, but from there they can go in a lot of different directions. The other thing that we find is that states are continually changing things. So in the child maltreatment 2015, 13 states out of 50 clearly indicated in their report that changes in either policy, practice, or data system made it unwise to use their data to show trends from prior years, right? And I believe another 14 states had possible issues. So I just get a little crabby because that never stopped the feds from having a headline saying child maltreatment is up or down. Here's another example, if we can see this. Oftentimes we find that states submit corrected data after the report's published. So for example, in this report, in Child Maltreatment 2014, the number of cases in 2013 was 679, which was considered a reduction from 680,000, and that was the headline that year, right? Child abuse cases down, that was the headline in their press release. But look what happens. The next year, when everything's corrected, the number of cases for 2013 is now 682, so the decrease that was the headline is now actually an increase. And these are actually tables that I cut and pasted out of the reports. So, okay, the one thing that we do know from these reports, which I find troubling, is consistently the number of cases screened out. That means somebody makes a call and they don't get beyond a call even to be investigated. So the number, and this is nationally, the number of cases screened out continues to be going up. And this trend has been true for probably the last 8 years. So in 2014, you had 3.6 million referrals, that's the phone call, and 39% were just screened out. The next year, you've got it's almost a 10%, you've got 4 million referrals and 41% screened out. So you've got more calls coming in and a higher percent screened out. So those of us at Prevent Child Abuse in America and those of us concerned about the welfare of kids in of children in our communities, I really ought to be concerned about who are those people. Even if half of those calls were wrong numbers, that's a couple of million kids around the country where someone's reaching out for help and they're not getting it from the Child Protective Services system, which may be okay if there are other systems in place to support those kids and families. The other study that I mentioned, which I think has lots more credibility, is the National Incidence Studies. The National Incidence Studies use public health methodologies to estimate the incidence and prevalence in the US population, right? So it's not based on actual records, because actually the prior reports, I would argue what they really are their measures of Child Protective Services workload, because all it's really telling us is who's being serviced by the system. Where the National Incidence Studies, by using public health data collection and interviewing methodologies, really was able to get an excellent estimate on incidence and prevalence. So the first report was done in '78, right after CAPTA was funded. The second report came out in '87, then '95, and then NIS4 came out in '06. And these are really considered the benchmark studies for telling us, is child maltreatment going up or down? And in the last one, when we compared '06 to '95, every type of maltreatment appeared to be on the decline except neglect. NIS5, now these numbers, these are the years the report were published. So data collection usually started 2 years before. So for NIS4, data collection started in '04. Well, NIS5, it's now 2017. NIS5 has not been started, and we can't blame the current administration. This goes back, it should have started in like 2014. There's strong indication from administration officials that there may not be a NIS5, and that is a pretty huge loss to the profession in the opinions of lots of us. And working with one of our major national advocacy groups down in Washington, the off-the-record email we got back from the Administration for Children, Youth, and Families is, we're considering methodologies to give us a better estimate, which could be good or not so good, but those of us that understand the concept of reliability, if you change up the methodology, are we going to be able to compare it to NIST 4.3.2.1? And do we then lose the half a century of experience we have at really tracking child maltreatment using a public health approach? So that's an interesting. Just want to talk for a second about the social ecological model. And this is a model that's used a lot by the CDC, and besides that I like the model, I've learned if the CDC uses it, it's a good idea to jump on the game with them because they've got a lot of credibility and a lot of places. In the social ecological model of promoting public health, they say we look at interventions directed toward individuals, relationships, community, and society. So using that model, let's higher up on the social, if we go higher up on the social ecology, some of those numbers that I've just been talking about were just pretty much about individuals and relationships, kids and families. But what would we be measuring higher up the social ecology? We want to be looking, for example, at research findings on policies associated with decreased maltreatment. And there's some really good policy level reports that tell us, for example, communities that have a zero waiting list for subsidized childcare have a much lower rate of reported child abuse and neglect. Communities, and this other one is kind of arcane, but communities or states that don't require redetermination every 6 months for Medicaid eligibility show a statistically significant decrease in child maltreatment. So there's things that we know from the research that we could be assessing kind of higher up on the social ecology. We know from the political science literature that one of the key things we want to look for is leadership. We want leadership for change and leadership for policy innovation, and I think it's wonderful that Penn State is providing that leadership to the state of Pennsylvania. So that's one thing. If we were measuring in Pennsylvania, we'd certainly see some wonderful things haven't happened in the last 5 years. Then we also want to look at, can we measure social norms? Social norms are defined as what people in a group believe to be typical and/or appropriate behavior. Okay? And the whole science of measuring social norms is kind of a new wave in measuring child well-being, and it's something it can provide us both tools to promote social change and excuse me, tools that would help us measure it. So the CDC did some research where they were measuring social norms in a couple of different ways, which is asking people what they actually do, what you think other parents in their state do, and what they think the opinion would be of the people that they trust most. And they found some positive norms, right? 80% or more reported positive parenting behavior, like catching your kid being good or consistently responding to a cry of child. So 80% had as a social norm that was something that they did. 90% thought that was something that everybody thought was a good thing. But only 36 and 37% thought that the majority of parents in their state did these things. So that's our gap in social norms. I know it's a good idea to treat my kid this way, but I don't think other people think that's the right thing. So that gives us something, a messaging goal around public education to make norms more congruent around child well-being. Some negative norms: 15% of parents of kids under 5 reported spanking their children every day or almost every day. 12% thought the majority of parents in their state spanked their kid every day or almost every day. And 20% thought that this is what they should be doing. So I will do a brief commercial for my current employer, APSAC, the American Professional Society on the Abuse of Children, and tell you that we are convening a national summit to end corporal punishment in the fall, where there's ways for us to interface on that, because the research findings are very, very clear of the damages of corporal punishment, yet we know that, that 15% of parents are doing it all the time, with that frequency. 12% think everybody's doing it with that frequency, and 1 out of 5 believe that that's what they ought to be doing. So what's my vision? When we look at all these things that we could be measuring, should be measuring, are or aren't measuring, I boil it down to one very simple question. Is every child in our state linked to at least one grown-up who has everything it takes to raise a healthy, happy, productive child? Right, just reframe this from counting kids whose name made it into a registry of some sort. Is every child connected to at least one grown-up who has all of the resources to raise a happy, healthy, productive citizen? Right? I refer to that as my one child, one grown-up campaign. That every child should have a parent that's got the time and the heart and the energy to stare lovingly into a baby's eyes like that and see that engagement. That's where babies start to develop their sense of self. And what do parents need? If my vision is every child connected to at least one grown-up, well, let's move up the social ecology. They need economic stability. They need quality health services for themselves and their families. They need quality education for themselves and the families. And more studies are pointing out to how much housing underlies all of that. You know, so that when we just look at a behavior without looking higher up the social ecology, we're missing the point that if my wage doesn't support decent housing, am I going to end up in the child welfare system as being neglectful, right? And that's a dilemma. At the base of the social ecology is promoting healthy relationships. And that's where I have to talk again, segue back to my work in child sex abuse, because I firmly believe that it is a child's right to have accurate information about their bodies, about bodies that are different from theirs, and understand how the human body functions. Going to be just a drop graphic for a second, but if we're talking about sex abuse, that has to happen. And one of the things out of all, and this is where I credit where tying the IFS and health education together. Everybody working in this field needs to understand that human sexual arousal is an autonomic response, right? And sometimes arousal is just arousal, and sometimes arousal becomes climax. Just what bodies do. And at different ages, it's more frequent and more often. Why do I think that's so critical for kids to know that? Because when they don't know that, they are subject to the lies of a molester who tells them they weren't a victim because of the way their body responded. Okay? And that is particularly damaging to boys, for whom the climax is more obvious than it can be for a girl. And to be molested and not know that, and to really think, I don't have permission to feel like a victim because my body did this, that is devastating. And that's one of the long-term consequences of child sex abuse that, and I see people agreeing, thank you, I hope you're agreeing, you're nodding your heads. That's one of the long-term consequences of sex abuse that those of us that are health educators, that are sex educators can deal with. When I think of the work of Dr. Delisavoy in giving parents the tools they needed to raise healthy kids, that's very much, the legacy of that is very much in my work. My belief is that we should be working to equip parents to be the primary sex educators of their kids, empowering parents to send their kids out in the world with age-appropriate, accurate information wrapped up in their family's values. My family's values may be to be all buttoned up. Your family's values may be you can come to breakfast in your underwear. That's fine. But human anatomy, human physiology is not negotiable. It is what it is. And when we send kids out in the world without that, we're doing them a disservice. So to that end, I brought a dozen copies of my book, and I want to make sure each of the Delisavoy students leave with one. And then I think there were some other students that were here with us at lunch today. Are you guys here, the lunch students? Well, I have a dozen. Oh, good, okay. So students first, and then the other, and the Delisavoys as well. And then I'm happy to, and where's my friend from Nurse Family Partnership? That would be a good thing for you guys to have. I'd like to make sure that, that I devote that, a big part of my career to that particular message, because Penn State gave me the skills and credentials to be a sex educator, and I've taken them with me throughout all the other work that I've done in my career and integrated that because I just believe it's so important. But back to the one child, one grown-up, the economics are getting more difficult. We can no longer take upward mobility for granted in this society. I was on a conference call with folks from my alma mater, from Dean Elwood at Harvard's Kennedy School, who's got a grant from the Gates Foundation to run a project called the U.S. Partnership on Mobility from Poverty. And one of the things that he shared was that for boys born after 1980, only 40% are going to make more money than their fathers. A generation before that, that was close to 90. And also they're talking about the politics of place. For each year a child lives in a distressed neighborhood, it reduces lifetime income by 1.5% per year. So it's the economies of place, the politics of place, and one of the goals that they're looking at is how can we help families achieve a reasonable standard of living, have power over their own lives, and be engaged and valued in their community, right? Really important questions. And as someone who works in child welfare, a question that I threw back to Dean Elwood is, let's talk about the fact that the child protection system, which I love and I've devoted most of my career to, when we look at the nexus between 3/4 of the cases of maltreatment are neglect, the majority of neglect has got its roots in poverty, and there really is not a system in child protection that meets those standards. Our child protection system does not help people achieve a reasonable standard of living. It does not give people power over their lives, and it really doesn't help people feel engaged and valued in their community. In fact, it makes them want to hide if the neighbors see a county car pull up in front of their house. So I throw that out as a little bit more food for thought as we think about the whole one child, one grown-ups idea. And then, what do I think parents need to promote sexual health and safety? Accurate information about anatomy and physiology, accurate information about psychosexual development, comfort and practice sharing this with children, the opportunity to explore their own values, to live in a community where social norms value children and parenting, right? To live in a community where you have social norms that support parents seeking help for the difficult job that is parenting. And to live in a community where you've got social norms that don't blame victims, particularly victims of online sexual exploitation and bullying. Right? So these are some of the things that parents need, I believe, to help them do the job that they need to raise sexually safe and healthy children. So what is my call to action for you as my time starts to draw to a close? I ask you to just keep this one child, one grown-up concept in the back of your mind as you go about your work. When you teach about child development, that you're not just looking at the child, you're looking holistically at what the parent brings to that family. When you analyze public data, that you don't take any single data point to mean any more than it's a single data point. And for those of you that are faculty, when you work to prepare the next generation of professionals and scholars to promote healthy human development across the social ecology and through the lifespan. And on that last note, I want to invite any of the students that are present here today to join APSAC, the American Professional Society on Abuse of Children. For anybody here today or any of Jenny's students, I will cut the registration in half so you get used to reading your professional journals, reading the Journal of Child Maltreatment, reading the newsletters that come out. It's too easy for us, particularly in our professions, which tend to be starved for money, that you don't read a journal article again the minute you leave school unless you go back to grad school. So I want to put my money where my mouth is and make that as easy as possible for any of the students in the child maltreatment minor, and invite you to become members of APSAC at half price, and I will have our online registration set up with a Penn State, with a discount code for all of you guys to use. I'd really like to promote the scholarship and sharing the information, and as you begin developing your own work, and some of you, I heard about some research projects and even some undergraduate theses that were done. The beauty of an organization like APSAC is while we've got our peer-reviewed journals, we've also got newsletters where you don't have to go through the whole peer-reviewed process. If your advisor says it's good enough to print, we'll put it in a newsletter and get it out for you nationally. So let's join together, make the field of child maltreatment as vibrant as it can possibly be, respecting the multidisciplines that make child maltreatment, intervention, and prevention the critical thing that it is, and I applaud you for giving me this platform for this last hour, so thank you. Okay. Yes, thank you.
If you're one child, one grown-up theory, do you need it from the viewpoint of it has to be an actual parent, or just that child having any adult in their life to provide?
Well, I parse the words particularly for that reason. I say one child, one grown-up, because that grown-up may not necessarily be a parent. The CDC is investing a lot of money into child abuse prevention and child development work because of the ACE studies. Is everybody familiar with the ACE studies, the Adverse Child Experience Studies? And what the CDC refers to what they call an SSNR, which is a safe, stable, nurturing relationship. And the research that's coming out of some of the ACE studies and the other work that's being done indicates that even if a child is exposed to consistent levels of even traumatic stress, which is ongoing, that the presence of a safe, stable, nurturing relationship to buffer the impact of that stress reduces some of the effects that might otherwise be seen. So I might have called it one child, one SSNR, but that would have been boring. So I'm really referring to the concept of that SSNR. Yes?
If we could get to that point, how much do you think, how low could we knock down the incidence of child abuse?
I don't think it's ever going to disappear completely. And I think people that, I don't know that anybody has ever promised that. I mean, when I've worked in politics, have said, Governor, I wish I could promise you there'd be no child deaths in our state, but there's probably going to be that. But we can, I mean, do you as a scholar have any estimates on how much prevention programs could actually reduce things?
Well, it depends how deep you dig.
Right.
I mean, one of the disturbing trend that's happening now is for kids in placement. The number one reason for kids to go to placement in Pennsylvania is failure of the parent to cope. And that cope has never been defined until very recently because that statistic is going up and up and up, and now it's about 40% of placements. So they've been forced to define what cope means, and it's housing, and it's poverty, and I can't pay my bills. Right? So if we dig deeper, the deeper we dig, the better the effects, right? And
we also know from multiple reports that child maltreatment costs the taxpayers billions of dollars. There's one study says $80 billion a year, another would say 124, depending, but let's all agree it's got a lot of zeros at the end. And I'm always shocked when public officials are penny wise and pound foolish when they stop funding prevention or family support programs because in some cases, well, the result won't be seen for 10 years out. Why should I invest $10 million when someone from the other party is going to get the benefit 10 years from now when I'm out of office? So we know that we've got programs that have got really strong evidence bases that will reduce the risk of maltreatment in families, and it's been quantified, different kinds of interventions with different kinds of families. The real challenge is bringing those programs to scale so that they're available to every family who would qualify. And often it comes down to issues of economics.
One more. Yeah. What is the
consider yours as follow-up, so it
Oh,
won't.
sorry. What if we restricted it to education for parents on preventing child sexual abuse? And then how far could you knock down the child sexual abuse by educating parents and by doing the thing about making them more comfortable to talk about it and all of that? What do you think?
I'm not going to quantify that while I'm wearing a microphone. My sense is that we will reduce the risk of a child getting entrapped in a certain number of cases, in a respectable number of cases, and more importantly, we'll reduce the harm and the damage for a child who couldn't avoid being entrapped, right? Because one of the other things that we can't do in the prevention world is make it sound like prevention is foolproof, because then what we end up with is parents who feel like failures if their child was struck by lightning, so to speak. So it's very difficult to quantify, but we know retrospectively how little so many victims knew about that sort of thing when they were victimized, and how often, particularly for boys, they were entrapped by their body's own physical response into thinking, oh, this is what happens. So yes.
So one hand over there, yeah. Is there a lot of work being done on preventing someone from becoming a childhood sexual abuser?
Yes. So that's finally getting some good attention. Some of the best work is being done at Johns Hopkins by Elizabeth Letourneau at the Moore Center for Sex Abuse Prevention, and I would refer you to the stuff that's being written in that being written by that organization. So before we end, I want to remind any of the students here to please come up and get a copy of my book. This is not a signing; it's a giveaway. I'm happy to sign it, but and then if there's any extras, I'll make sure that other folks that really want a resource to help them empower parents, that I make sure you get it. And if I run out of the free ones, if you buy them on the APSAC website, the proceeds all go to prevent child abuse, to helping APSAC. So at apsac.org, you can get them there. So thank. Oh.
So Janet, we have a memento of this wonderful
Well, you
talk.
sure do.
So we hope that it'll grace an office or your home.
Yes.
Give you a memory of how much we really enjoyed your talk and your presentation. You did us proud.
Thank you. I hope I continue to make Penn State proud wherever I go. Thank you. Oh, here. Okay. We'll do yes, here, right.
You've got a professional back there. Good?
He's got it?
Great.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you all very much. Students, don't forget how much to get the book.
Yes.